Hi, and welcome back to Applied Behavior Analysis in Early Childhood. And so far we've covered behavior and environment, and respondent behavior, which is behavior exclusively controlled by antecedent stimuli, as well as an introduction to operant behavior, which is behavior that is affected by consequences. And specifically, we focus on the reinforcement of operant behavior, which is the increase in the future probability that the behavior will occur. And in this unit, we focus on punishment of operant behavior, which is a decrease in the future probability that the behavior will occur. Now, I want to start you off with a quote from Tim Vollmer in 2002. And he said, "Punishment is a topic of considerable debate, which at times has become heated. In my view, scientists interested in the nature of human behavior cannot ignore or otherwise obviate the study of punishment. There should be no controversy. Scientists and practitioners are obligated to understand the nature of punishment, if for no other reason than because punishment happens." Okay, and that was back in 2002. I'm recording this in 2017, and punishment is still a topic of considerable debate. And at the time that Tim Vollmer wrote this, there was a steady decline in research on punishment and applied behavior analysis. And there's punishment in applied behavior analysis is still occurring at a very low level. And we're going to talk about some considerations related to the importance of studying punishment and using punishment and application later in this unit. I just want to talk a little bit more about this quote first. Obviate means to make unnecessary, or to make unnecessary. And so what Vollmer was saying here is that from his perspectives, scientists can't just conclude that it's not important or necessary to study punishment, and we can't just ignore it, even though research and in fact even application of punishment can be uncomfortable, aversive, and very emotional for some clinicians, even some researchers. But he said there really shouldn't be controversy. That's what he's saying here. Because punishment is occurring in the environment, whether folks recognize it or whether they can, identify the variables that function as punishment with respect to operant behavior. It's happening in every environment. And so if we're going to modify or create or engineer environments that are maximally reinforcing, maximally punishing, and that have the maximal effect on learning and improvements in quality of life, then we're going to need to understand how punishment works so we can use it to our advantage towards those goals. All right. So we have 7 objectives in this unit here, and so we're going to begin with objective 1, which is define and describe punishment, punish, and punisher, and then discriminate between examples and non-examples of punishment. 3 is to list or complete a diagram of 4 types of punishment based on provenance and the direction of change, and then identify descriptions of generalized condition, let's just say punishers. Identify and discriminate between examples and non-examples of some variables that influence the effectiveness of punishment. Then you're going to identify reasons researchers and practitioners should understand how punishment works. And then in Objective 7, you'll identify and describe 5 myths, according to Sapani, and a misconception that lead to the misuse or abuse of punishment. Okay, objectives. 1 is define and describe punishment, punish, and punisher. 2 is discriminate between examples and non-examples of punishment. So punishment refers to a process or an operation. And correct uses of the word punishment include the following. You could say, I'm using punishment or punishment decreased the future probability of responding, or punishment occurred. Alright, so in this case you're saying I'm using the operation or procedure punishment. In the second one, you're referring to the process. Punishment as a process is a decrease in the future probability of responding. And the same thing goes here. It refers to the process. Punishment occurred. Now, a punisher is a consequent stimulus that decreases the future probability of a behavior. Correct uses of the word punishment include the following. You can say, I delivered a punisher. The toy functioned as a punisher. You could also say something like the response produced a punisher, or the behavior was followed by a punisher, or the punisher was delivered contingent on the behavior. A punisher is a consequence that decreases the future probability of a response class, or members of a response class. And you could consider the response class to, you could punish a functional response class or in a topographical response class. In other words, you could apply a punisher to two or more topographies that have different functions, or two or more topographies that have the same function. You could punish a single topography in a variety of contexts. To punish is to deliver a punisher. So that's the operation, or that's the procedure, to deliver a punisher. The punisher is the consequence. So in case this doesn't stand out yet, the punisher is the consequence. Punishment is the process or operation, or procedure. To punish is to use the procedure or to engage in that operation. It's to deliver the punisher. So correct uses of the word punish include, you can say, I decided to punish the behavior, or did you punish the behavior, or I punished the behavior. Notice that we are talking about punishment in relation to behavior, not organisms. So I don't say punish the rat, punish the pigeon, punish the student, punish the learner, punish the person, punish him, punish her. No, punish behavior. Punish behavior because punisher is a consequence that decreases the future probability of a response class, or future probability of behavior. So punishment alters the probability of behavior, not organisms. So we don't say I punished the student, I was punished by, but we can say punishment was provided for the behavior, or the electric shock punished lever pressing, or I punished self-biting. Okay, so let's look at critical and variable features of punishment. So remember, critical features of punishment are those characteristics of consequences that are always present in a case of, or in a scenario in which the consequence functions as punishment. So punishment is a function of a consequence in this case. And how do we know if a consequence is functioning as punishment? Well, the consequence is contingent on the behavior. That's the first critical feature. And the consequence decreases the future probability of the response in similar contexts. Now notice it's not just that the behavior decreases in probability in the future. It's that the consequence decreases the future probability of the behavior in similar contexts. Okay, so you don't want to confuse punishment with other processes that reduce the future probability of behavior, such as extinction. Extinction is when a reinforcer is withheld for the behavior, and as a result, the behavior decreases in probability in the future. Here, this is something different. You have a consequence that decreases the future probability of the response in similar contexts. So, in other words, it's not that a consequence is withheld, it's that a consequence is delivered. That consequence is either going to be the addition or the removal of some aspect of the environment, but we'll talk about that in a few moments here. Okay, how else do you know if something's punishment? Well, the learner does not need to be able to identify or describe the consequence for it to function as punishment. This is the automaticity of punishment. So we talked in the prior unit about the automaticity of reinforcement. We also talked about automatic reinforcement. Okay, so let's make sure we're still maintaining that distinction. So automatic reinforcement is reinforcement that occurs independent of other people. That's different from socially mediated reinforcement. But we're not talking about automatic here. Automaticity of reinforcement is that reinforcement works or it occurs whether or not someone can identify or describe it or talk about it. Well, the same thing goes for punishment. Okay, this isn't automatic punishment that I'm talking about. We're talking about automaticity of punishment, which is just that characteristic of punishment that it occurs, it happens, whether or not someone can identify or describe it. And probably the automaticity of punishment is related to what Tim Vollmer was saying, as I quoted in a previous slide, is that punishment is happening, and most of the time, in most cases, people don't recognize it. They're not able to identify it or talk about it, and so, and even under those circumstances, people will tell you they don't use punishment, or they don't like punishment, or punishment is unacceptable, or there's no, or their classroom or their home or this location, they don't use punishment. Well, they do. It is happening. Punishment has that automaticity quality. So, okay, so those are the critical features of punishment. Now, there are variable features of punishment, which means some instances of punishment have these features and others don't. And I mentioned in a prior unit that it's very useful, and actually it's extremely important to study these concepts by trying to generate novel examples, each of which contain the critical features of punishment, but which change in terms of the variable feature of punishment. And I'll demonstrate that in examples provided in the next slide. But first, let's list those variable features of punishment. So we have punishment may be conditioned or conditioned, so learned or unlearned, ontogenic provenance or phylogenetic provenance. Punishment may be socially mediated or automatic. Socially mediated punishment involves other people. Automatic punishment is a sensory consequence produced by the behavior independent of other people. And then automatic punishment may also be some outcome or response product or some permanent change in the environment as a result of the behavior. It can be planned or unplanned. And punishment, the stimulus is delivered or removed immediately following the behavior. So that's another variable feature. So that consequence that functions as punishment, remember punishment is a function of a consequence. This consequence may be a stimulus delivered, contingent on the occurrence of the behavior targeted for punishment, or removed, contingent on the occurrence of the behavior targeted for punishment. That's a variable feature. Okay, so that's the same thing as saying punishment can be positive or negative. Okay, examples of punishment. Now, every time, and only when, she bit her nails, she was required to engage in 3 minutes of exercise. In the future, she stopped biting her nails. Okay, we have the critical features of the contingency and the decrease in the future probability. We can assume automaticity. And we have these other variable features. Okay, so this is conditioned. This is learned. This consequence has its effects due to experience and a learning history. It's something added, and it was planned. Okay. In the past, he ran in the store often, but then one day, while running in the store, the boy turned too quickly and hit his head on the corner of a shelf, resulting in painful stimulus. In the future, he stopped running in stores. Now, there are the defining features. So, if and only if the kid did this would he have hit his head on the corner of the shelf. And then there's a decrease in the future probability. It was unplanned. Nobody planned for that to happen. And it's unconditioned because painful stimulation is unlearned. So those are our two variable features there that we changed or that we included in this example that could be modified to create a new example. Contingent on pretending to sleep in class, he lost a token that could later be redeemed to buy extra free play time. As a result, he stopped engaging in this behavior in the future. There's the defining features, a decrease in the future probability, as well as the contingency. And the variable features are that it's conditioned, token punishers, the loss or removal of a token is a conditioned punisher. Tokens function as conditioned punish. So there's some type of conditioning or some type of learning history that would lead to a token to function this way. And then it was removed, right? So this would be negative punishment. And it was planned. Okay, contingent on pretending to sleep in class, the teacher asked him a very difficult question, which she planned to do each time he exhibited this behavior. As a result, he stopped engaging in this behavior in the future. Okay, we have the contingency, we have a decrease in probability in the future. And she asked him a very difficult question. That was planned. It's something added, so positive punishment. And it's conditioned. When the toddler bit or tried to bite his mother, she prompted him to complete a shape sorter 5 times. She didn't ask him to do this at any other time. This consequence eliminated the future occurrence of biting and bite attempts, so decrease in the future probability. We have a contingency. This one was planned. It was something added, so positive punishment, and then it was conditioned. Due to learning history, the shape sorter began to function as a punisher. Or less more specifically, being asked to complete the shape sorter 5 consecutive times became a punisher. Okay, here's an example of punishment. We're going to distinguish it from punisher and punish. So during bath time, the child turned the wrong knob on the bathtub faucet, which poured out scalding hot water. The hot water functioned as punishment, and then it decreased the future probability the child would turn the wrong knob. This is a wonderful example of how punishment does occur in the natural environment. And in most cases, unless you had learned about it this way, in the past you probably didn't. You would have been very unlikely to think about such a scenario as punishment. But it has the defining features, right? It's a contingency, and it decreased the future probability that the child would repeat the behavior under similar contexts. So this is an example of punishment, which is the decrease in the future probability the child would turn the wrong knob. That's the punishment. Example of punisher. You incorrectly swing the golf club, and your golf ball lands in the sand pit. The ball landing in the sand pit functions as a punisher in that it decreased the future probability you swing the golf club in the same way. Now, punishment is that decrease in the future probability, but the punisher is the ball landing in the sand pit. Example of punish. One student publicly makes fun of another student's clothing. Public ridicule punished the students' wearing of particular types of clothing to school in that it decreased wearing such types of clothing to school in the future. Okay, this is an example of of punish, because we're focusing on the delivery of the public ridicule. Okay, so public ridicule punished. So another way we can say this is that the student decided to punish the other student's wearing of clothing. They probably didn't think about it that way, but that's one way we can describe it. But anyways, the focus on punishment here is the delivery of the punisher. Okay, it's the making fun of the other student's clothing. That's punishing them. Here, the punisher was the ball landing in the sand pit. Punishment up here was the process of the future decrease in probability the child would turn the wrong knob. Here's a non-example of punishment, punisher, or punish. The boy stole cookies and mom gave him a spanking. In the future, he continued to steal cookies. Spanking did not decrease the future probability of stealing, so spanking was not punishment. The spanking was not a punisher, and mom did not punish her son's behavior because it's missing the defining feature, right? It didn't decrease the future probability of stealing. That's a defining feature of punishment. So although spanking may have hurt, it may have been unpleasant, or whatever, it may have had those properties or characteristics, it didn't have the property of punishment. It didn't punish the behavior. So by now, before we proceed, I want to emphasize something that we use the word punishment or punisher or punish as technical terms. highly precise technical terms to refer to the function of a consequence. We listed two general functions of consequences in the prior unit: reinforcement and punishment. So when I say what are two general functions of consequences, you should be able to quickly list reinforcement and punishment. Okay, and from there you may also be asked to list types of reinforcement or types of punishment or something like that. If you're asked to list functions of behavior, that wouldn't be reinforcement and punishment. All the functions of a behavior would be reinforcement. So that would be escape, tangible, attention, avoidance. All right. So those would be functions of behavior. Those are categories of reinforcement. Punishment is not a function of behavior. Punishment is a function of consequences. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example of a study here. This was conducted by Clark, Robury, Bear, and Bear in 1973. So this is an old classic study of punishment, and they used timeout as the punisher. And this study included an 8-year-old child with intellectual disability, and the study was conducted in a special preschool program. And the child engaged in severe challenging behavior in class, like hitting, kicking, pinching, choking, pulling on clothing or hair. And they had two conditions, okay, baseline and treatment. And they they implemented the intervention in what's called evaluated the intervention using what's called a multiple baseline across behaviors design. But it's really across topography. So notice there's 1, 2, 3 graphs here. In the top graph, or the top panel, they evaluated the effects of timeout, a potential punisher, on chokes and arm wraps. In the second panel, they evaluated the effects of timeout on other attacks towards people, and they would have defined specifically what those topographies were. And then these were attacks towards materials. Right? Notice that during baseline, well, you can't tell here, but during baseline, attention was provided only for good behavior. So they tried to reinforce appropriate topographies in a way that would decrease challenging behavior by delivering attention for only good behavior. And as you can see, even though they did that during baseline, this challenging behavior continued to occur. And in fact, notice it started to really increase across days for attacks towards materials. Then they implemented timeout. Well, timeout is believed to function as a negative punishment procedure, or it's conceptualized that way, and it's contingent on severe challenging behavior. Okay, so when she, for example, in the top panel, when she engaged in chokes and arm wraps, they placed her in timeout room for at least 3 minutes. All right, but they didn't. Once they introduced timeout for chokes and arm wraps, you can see that they didn't yet implement treatment for these other topographies. That's part of the experimental design. They wanted to evaluate the effects of timeout, determine if it's a punisher, by seeing if its presence in the environment coincides with a decrease in the challenging behavior, and by verifying that other topographies that didn't contact timeout didn't change, right? And that's what happened. So here's baseline. They introduced timeout. They saw a large sustained decrease in chokes and arm wraps coinciding with the introduction of timeout. So then what they did is they thought, okay, it looks like that works, but let's verify. So they introduced timeout later on other attacks towards people and attacks towards materials, and you can see they replicated the large immediate and sustained decrease in challenging behavior coincided with when they introduced timeout. So these data provide causal evidence that timeout functioned as punishment for challenging behavior. Okay, so let's do some ASRs. ASR 1, punishment decreases the blank probability of behavior. Is it A, current, B, future, or C, past? Give a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer here is future, decreases the future probability of behavior. We'll do one more ASR and then we'll take a break. ASR 2, negative reinforcement and punishment are the same thing. A true or B false? Give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is B, false. Remember, negative doesn't mean good, bad. It means something removed. Reinforcement means increase in future probability. Punishment means decrease in future probability of behavior. Okay, so let's take a break here. And we've covered a lot of material before we got to these ASRs, so I suggest going back and reviewing your guided notes for a little bit, maybe even watching one of the earlier parts of this video part 1, and then come on back and start video part 2, and we'll resume with ASR 3.